This is SRM Insider.
Welcome to the Full Disclosure Podcast, an SRM Insider podcast. My name is Matthew Mettenheimer, and I'll be your host today. For those of you joining us for the first time here on Full Disclosure is a podcast where we take a look at upcoming cyber regulations across the global landscape. Today, we have a very special episode where we're going to be diving into the upcoming regulations in the European Union. And with me today to discuss that is our head of the Cyber Advisory Group in the Benelux region, Gideon Teerenstra, and our associate who specializes in data privacy, Selma Mujcic. Thank you both for joining me today. It's really great to have you.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for having us.
Great. So to start off, could you give me a bit of an overview of what are some of the current regulatory trends coming across Europe?
Gladly. There are a few commonalities that we see, and I think they're not unique to the EU specifically, but of course we see its manifestation most clearly here. And it's that there's an increasing complexity, and though there's a sort of a running joke that where the US innovates, China imitates, and the EU regulates, and we see a lot of regulation coming our way from that perspective. Combine that with a shortage of skilled workforce and the fact that as an EU, there's a lot of legislation that needs to be transposed into national regulations, which further increase differences and complexity. That combined brings at least four that come to mind that we would love to discuss. And it's good to keep in mind that they're not just there because people think that legislation and regulation are a good idea. Specifically looking at, for example, DORA and NIS2, which we'll dive into in a bit. These are driven by the fact that we see more and more ransomware actors wreaking havoc, having fun in the environments at our clients and within all the industries. And they do that extremely well. Those insights have pushed and persuaded regulators to increase the regulatory pressure and increase the standards of cybersecurity that we need to adhere to.
Definitely a very good point, Gideon. We can see that in the current regulatory trends, also beginning with the NIS2, which stands for Network and Information Systems 2 Directive, which is an updated directive that expands the scope of the previous NIS directive, adding in security requirements to more sectors that are deemed essential or important within the market. It really comes to mandates about risk management, incident reporting, supply chain security measures, and it also introduces potential personal liability for management bodies. Member state must transpose it into national laws by October 2024, which is a very quick time frame. And the next one would be DORA.
And this is a bit of a different beast altogether. So the DORA stands for Digital Operational Resilience Act, and I know we've covered this in episode 1 as well. So if you want to understand the impact on the UK, definitely take a sneak peek there. What's important to know that it's different in the sense that it's EU regulation, and as such, it's directly applicable to all the EU member states in the same way, shape, and form. So that's a big difference to NIS2, which has all these national differences.
That's really interesting. And something, in the United States that we're not as familiar with. Obviously, we see state-by-state regulation, but federal regulation typically trumps all and is consistent throughout. It sounds almost similar in that regards, because if I'm hearing it correctly, DORA will be a consistent implementation no matter what nation you're a part of, but NIS2 will require each individual member state and each individual nation to have their own almost interpretation and nuances to the regulation. Is that right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Matt. So DORA it's sector specific. So it's for the financial sector in the entirety of the EU. And the standards are the same, and there may be minor implementation differences, but that's about it. If you look at NIS2, that's a different ballgame where local or national law will depict the actual implementation requirements, where the EU regulation sets the broader spectrum.
That's interesting. So if I'm a financial firm in Europe, no matter where I'm operating, I kind of have an understanding of what I'm going to have to be compliant with DORA. But if it sounds correct, if I'm some of those critical infrastructures that you laid out previously for NIS2, I'm going to have to start looking at each individual region that I might be operating in, those countries' interpretation of the law. That sounds like it can be really difficult for an organization to stay on top of. Do you see a lot of organizations struggle with this or any other particular challenges that they may have regarding it?
Absolutely, Matt. So one of the things that we see is that due to the fact that there are different timeframes that individual nations use to transpose the NIS2 in national law, we can see, for example, that the Belgian version is ready, where the Dutch version is still in draft. Of course, if you operate in both countries, this already increases the complexity, and it also makes it very unclear what standards you should implement and where you should implement those. Of course, this is also not something that we haven't seen before. As you may recall, the GDPR had a similar setup where, again, the EU prescribed the high-level sections of the GDPR, and national law created the local implementations, which also means that till date, there will be a difference in the GDPR between, say, France and Germany.
No, that's really interesting. And I love that perspective with how you lay that out there. Is there any, so outside of, understanding what specific countries are going to require specific regulatory requirements within the NIS2, are there any other sort of challenges that you can see coming up regarding these regulatory change, potentially in the AI space? Because we do know that's something that a lot of organizations are really putting a lot of effort into right now. And I could see that being having some cascading effects across, the European regulatory landscape or the markets.
Yes, definitely, Matthew. The AI Act, as we know it right now, is a very groundbreaking piece of legislation that just came out, which is aimed at ensuring the safe and ethical use of artificial intelligence across the EU. It establishes a regulatory framework to manage the risks that are associated with AI systems, focusing on their development, deployment, usage of these AI models. The AI Act is also designed to foster innovation, while also ensuring that AI technologies are developed and used in a way that protects public safety, but also fundamental rights and ethical standards. So the AI Act takes a risk-based approach, which means that there are 4 categories under which AI models could fall. One being unacceptable risk AI models. So think of the Clearview AI use cases, for example. So think of real-time biometric surveillance, which is an unacceptable risk to society, and societal scoring systems by governments. The next level below that will be high-risk AI models. Underneath that is the low-risk applications and the no-risk AI models. And the AI Act is now set to be published in the official journal of the European Union. So in the upcoming days or weeks, so we are waiting for it any day right now, so either in June or in July. And 20 days after that publication, in the official journal, the AI Act will officially enter into force as being EU law. And from that time frame, based on the risk level of your AI system, some provisions will apply either 6 months, 12 months, or 36 months after entry into force. So as you mentioned, there were some challenges, of course, also when it comes to AI and the AI Act. We see that this will have probably a huge impact on businesses using and developing AI technologies. As we all know, most businesses right now really are driving on these technologies, and they will most probably fall under the broad scope of this AI Act. And another important one to mention is that board members will have to understand those AI risks and start implementing the appropriate controls, meaning that they will have to know something, at least a basic knowledge about AI, probably.
Right. Wow. And that's really interesting. And most certainly, thank you for explaining that, because it's something that I've seen a lot of organizations struggle with here. Almost the complete opposite, where I've seen organizations go in and say, we're going to implement AI and then figure out the risks later or down the road, which most certainly as cybersecurity experts and data privacy experts obviously isn't our preferred route. But it sounds like, if I'm hearing this correctly, the AI Act really does put some guardrails behind it and actually tiers what your AI tool should and should not be allowed to do. But also, if you are in those specific categories, those 4 risk categories, there's additional guidance on specific security controls or data privacy controls to help protect consumers and users. That's really interesting. And most certainly, we're seeing AI regulations start being talked about in the United States, and there was an executive act, but most certainly nothing to this level. So I'm very interested to see how global organizations are going to comply with this, especially with also being in compliant with NIS2 and DORA coming all around the same time. That seems, really a big uplift for a lot of these organizations that might be playing in both space as well. I know that you mentioned that there are responsibilities in the AI Act, and I believe you said either NIS2 or DORA, that there is personal culpability, which is something we haven't seen a ton of over here in the U.S. Could you just kind of give me a little bit more insight of what, if a board needs to understand about AI or their personal liability in regards to these other upcoming regulations as well?
Matthew, actually, it's interesting that the NIS2 explicitly states that, for example, members of management bodies, boards, and senior managements are of covered entities may be held personally liable for infringement by their organizations and can even face a professional ban. So that, together with the DORA and with the AI Act, it will having very similar stipulations, which would mean that this will become very important on boards' agendas from now on.
No, that's really interesting. So if I'm a board member or if I'm part of the C-suite or executive committee of an organization, really with these upcoming acts, it seems to be that there won't be the excuse of, well, I wasn't aware of, or I didn't know that we were doing these processes or had these risky plans in place. They really need to be on top of and have a lot clearer picture into what their business is doing in regards to being compliant with these regulations, and also how they're utilizing AI for their business. So the old days of, we didn't know from the executive level, therefore it's not on our shoulders, doesn't sound like it's going to hold up going forward. Is that correct?
Yes, that is completely correct. In fact, cybersecurity training and awareness programs will from now on be one of the security controls that are similar throughout all of these regulatory trends, for example. So essential for both staff and for leaderships will be these awareness programs. Establishing an IT security risk awareness training or program helps building a culture of security within the organization, and that continuous education ensures that everyone within that organization understands their role in maintaining cybersecurity and can respond appropriately to potential threats instead of being very reactive about it, as you just described.
And this is a key element in these new and upcoming legislations. For board members, there are 2 individual and very personal new tasks that they basically get. And one is that they have a legal duty to be aware of the risks on the cybersecurity and AI front. And the second one is that they have the obligation to train themselves on that specific topic.
No, that's it. That's interesting. So you both are legally required, but also have to have that spirit of training and awareness across the organization. And I think that aligns with what we as security professionals have been saying for years, that your users and your members of your organization can be your strongest asset or your greatest weakness. And it sounds like these regulations are really putting that to the test, with not only do your typical day in and day out employees need to be on top of their cybersecurity, but all the way to the highest levels of an organization, we need to be thinking about how do we protect our data? How do we protect the business from these cybersecurity threats and stay ahead of those threat actors? That's really great. And I think that the personal liability aspect of it is so unique compared to what we've seen in the US. Obviously, we're seeing some things that might be changing in that sector going forward, but we haven't really seen anything too compounding yet. So I guess I'm just curious. So is it just personal liability could be the punitive measures, or are there other punitive actions that might be taken against an organization if they are out of compliance with these regulations?
Definitely. All three frameworks establish some form of administrative fines or penalties in case of non-compliance. So if we would go through all of them, it would be a very quick recap. For DORA, for example, leaves penalties to be defined by the member states itself, but indicates that they should be effective and proportionate. And for the NIS2, it actually suggests penalties up to 10 million euros or 2% of global turnover for essential entities. Now, that number is a little bit lower for the important entities, which are deemed a little bit less than the essential organizations falling under the NIS2. But it is still a very high fine. And the AI Act, in fact, tops all of them with a huge amount of 30 million euros or 6% of the global annual turnover for non-compliance with the AI Act.
Wow. So $30 million if you're not implementing AI correctly.
Euros.
Sorry, 30 million euros. I apologize. I should know better. Yes. The euros, 30 million euros. That's correct. So really, those examples I was saying over here that I'm seeing in the U.S. market of, great, we're going to implement an AI tool. We're going to have our company be really embedded with it. Well, if you're operating in Europe, you've got to start thinking through these problems. And even if you are an American-centric company, if you're in the European space, you might get fined up to that 30 million euro threshold. I got it correct this time. But it's something that we need to keep thinking about and making sure that we stay on top of, because we're so interconnected. And as you mentioned earlier, we'll start seeing even more specific implementations of that NIS2 with specific country regulations. I guess something that I'm curious about is, what are some of the notifications around this for non-compliance or for issues related to it?
So there are very short notification timescales, which is general across all of these regulatory frameworks. For example, DORA, given the sensitivity, of course, of financial data, specifies a very tight 24-hour reporting requirement for entities facing substantial operational or data continuity incidents. When it comes to the NIS2, requires that providers submit an early warning to the competent authority within 24 hours of becoming aware of a significant incident, and submit an incident notification within 72 hours. So within the AI Act, notifications are primarily related to high-risk AI systems, as we already mentioned them before. For example, in case of an incident with those high-risk AI systems, the national authorities must be notified within 15 days of becoming aware of that incident. So an incident would mean any malfunctions to that AI system or something that could harm people's health or safety.
Wow, that's incredible. So 24 hours for DORA and NIS2. I don't think I've ever seen a regulation that has a reporting mechanism that quickly. So if I'm an organization, I really need to get ahead of what I'm going to do in the case of a major incident occurring to my organization, because that stop clock is going to start and you have a very limited time frame to actually get ahead and report it to the regulators to be in compliance. And the AI Act, even more interestingly, the notification on a system malfunction, but also about could harm someone's health or safety. Now, with that specific clause, it immediately gets me thinking about organizations using AI in healthcare spaces or potentially the manufacturing space, where if they are using these tools to help either diagnose patients or help with, maintaining machines that, if they aren't properly tuned, could have damaging and physical harm to operators, you really need to be ahead of it and understand what those risks are, because that's still not a lot of time to investigate and understand what the issue is before reporting it to a regulator. I think that's really interesting that they have that specific carve out for people's health and safety, but a very great carve out.
And what's good to realize is that, for example, for DORA, we know that the Dutch supervisory body, the Authority Financial Markets, or AFM, in short, has doubled their capacity to also audit and challenge organizations on the compliance to DORA. So we know that this is a topic that doesn't just live with the regulators, but it's definitely also a focal point for the supervisory bodies in nations.
Interesting. So it's not going to be just your standard check the box exercise. It's really going to be, there's going to be credible challenge coming to your organization of, hey, if you say you're compliant with our regulation, we're really going to test you. We're going to make sure that you actually are in compliance and not just saying so. There's going to be some scrutiny behind it. So you better make sure that your organization is properly functioning and operating the way you say it is. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And that's where, as a board member, you have the responsibility to know your cybersecurity risks, to know cybersecurity in general, and you'll be tested against it, and your organization will be tested against it, which brings us to a whole different era in cybersecurity, where a board needs to be aware and needs to be involved much more actively than we've seen so in the past.
Absolutely. Board members are now got to be on notice. They have to understand what's going on in the organization. And with these complex cybersecurity challenges, you're going to have to stay up to date with it and understand what's impacting your business. And the days of burying your head in the sand seem long gone, and it's out into the light. I love that. And I think that's a really great change to some of the regulatory landscape. I love to see what you all are doing over in Europe, and hopefully, we see some similar interactions with the U.S. As you know, we always like to follow your regulatory lead.
Yeah, that would be great, Matt. I mean, it also creates a more level playing field if we're all looking at it from the same perspective. And we do expect that, apart from regulatory pressure, which of course this will initially increase, but we also expect that this will eventually lead to a better cybersecurity posture within the European market, which should in turn lead to a significant decrease in downtime due to cyber incidents, for example.
That's great. The whole sector, the whole industry getting more resilient, better at responding, I think is going to really help step up businesses' security maturity. And also, as we know, I'm not sure if the phrase translates as popular in Europe as it is in the US, but if you're a European company, you're following these strict regulations, you don't have to be the fastest zebra in the herd. You just have to be faster than the slowest zebra. And it sounds like these European companies are going to be leading the pack and not falling behind because of these regulatory measures.
Yes, and this is where everything comes together for a lot of these regulations. And it's also good to point out that although there are, in this case, 3 or 4 regulations that we see coming into effect very, very soon, there are things that combined can help you get towards compliance on all of those. one of the key points here is that, of course, you need to understand whether you're in scope. I mean, it all starts with that. If you are, then you need to understand that you need to deploy a strong ICT risk management framework or cyber risk management framework. And this is something that all legislations stipulate. And key in implementing these frameworks is to ensure that you understand the impact of the risks that you're having. So organizations must also continuously identify and manage all sources of risk effectively. Another aspect that's definitely worth pointing out is that the short notification time windows, they ensure that your disaster recovery and business continuity strategy and plans, they need to be good. They don't just need to be developed. You would definitely need to test them. They are crucial components of operational resilience, and these regulations all target your operational resilience. Regular testing of your incident preparedness is not longer a nice to have, but it's key to make sure that you actually comply to these laws and regulations. Now, of course, we are in that era where you can't do it alone, and you will need to work together with key vendors, such as your IT providers. So third-party risk monitoring is key within that operational resilience strategy.
That's great. And I love that third-party risk monitoring. It is a really important component because I've seen plenty of organizations go, okay, that's great. A regulation's coming in, but I don't have to worry about it because I have third parties to do all this. It sounds like because of how the regulations have been written, you can't just outsource that to your third party and say, well, as long as they're in compliance, I'm in compliance and I don't even need to check on it. You really do have to be proactive with managing your vendors and staying on top of them, of understanding your contractual obligations and how they're protecting, your data and your security, because they are an integral part of it. Something that listeners may not know, Gideon and I actually work together quite closely on third-party risk management across the globe. And I think with these regulatory changes, we're going to see an even further scrutiny on how organizations need to be on top of their vendor management and understanding the risk associated with each individual relationship. That's great to see there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Matt. And one of the big differences that we're already seeing is that third-party risk management is transforming from asking relatively generic questions such as, is the vendor ISO 27001 certified, or do you have a SOC 2 Type 2 attestation, into more specific questions related to specific risks to your organization. And that, of course, is a tremendous difference in the approach to the third-party risks.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's great to hear. So thinking through, you mentioned business continuity and disaster recovery. You have to start thinking through that planning should the event occur. But also that makes me think we also might have to be proactive on how are we going to respond if an incident occurs? Are there additional, stipulations that organizations really should be looking into developing out an incident response plan or developing even further playbooks for their organization? Is that part of the regulation as well?
Well, a very robust incident response plan definitely is a must from now on. So so that would involve developing and regularly updating an incident response playbook, for example, so that you know when to detect, when to manage, when to notify any incidents, but also to have regular exercises to check whether your plan still works. And to test these plans to ensure that the organizations are always prepared to handle incidents swiftly. It doesn't suffice anymore to just have the plan ready and on your desk somewhere. We really encourage organizations to stress test these incident response plans from now on, because we have seen that the notification periods are so incredibly short. 24 hours is not a long time if an incident occurs, both under DORA and under NIS2, especially seeing how many new entities will also be falling under this legislation that may not in the past have fallen under this.
Yeah. No, that's great. As the great Mike Tyson once said, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face. So it sounds like we need to get in the ring, start sparring, giving that practice, potentially going through tabletop exercise, business continuity, recovery, planning, and testing. So really, there's no longer, we have a plan in place. It sits in my top desk, but it hasn't been looked at in the last 3 years. We need to make sure that, hey, this actually works for our organization, and it's something that we can to respond through, instead of, well, we identify that we don't even have the same environment from when we last developed it. We need to really be proactive in actually testing it out. That's really great. Gideon, I know you mentioned that there are a lot of nuances in each of those individual countries, and I've been trying to wrap my head around it. How would I stay on top of understanding what's the specific regulations for each individual nation? Do you have any tips for our listeners on how they can stay ahead of that?
Gladly. As you know, and as we've seen, and as some of the listeners might know, we've seen a similar effect when the GDPR was developed. What we already know is if you start preparing early, this helps you significantly, because otherwise you have to play catch up. So what this means is that you need to assess relatively early on whether you're in scope, what your gap assessments are, and implement the known measures in the jurisdictions that you have. This could mean that if you have one IT service organization serving multiple organizations or divisions within multiple countries in the EU, that you adhere to the most stringent one, because that's usually easier than trying to specialize it and then being very stringent in one country and having the same service provided less stringently to another. So that's definitely step one. Start preparing early, understand whether you are in scope and what you need to do. Second bit is that they all focus on enhancing your third-party risk management. Similarly to the case for data processors under the GDPR. And what we learned there is the importance of managing the risks in that process. DORA needs to further emphasize this robust process in your supply chain risk management, which means that even though for example, the Dutch implementation might not be completely specific, we already know third-party risk management will be a key element, and we already know that there are very good third-party risk management standards to implement and to adhere to. Doing that will get you at least 90% of the way on that specific bit. And that's, again, I'd say the third and final point to really incorporate is you need to leverage existing frameworks and controls. We know that frameworks such as ISO 27001, NIST, so with T, and IST, for example, and specific frameworks for example, third-party risk management, they are there and they have at least 80 to 90% of the coverage that these legislations will have. So in that sense, starting with those existing frameworks and controls, implementing those on those areas where you know you have a gap will get you ahead of the curve.
No, absolutely. So from what I'm hearing, let's use what we learned from GDPR when that was implemented. Get ahead of the game, start that process early. When you are testing yourself, test yourself against the strictest nations, because that's where you're going to have the best return on your investigation. Understand that these third parties are part of your responsibility and that you need to be proactive in managing them. And when possible, look at some of those industry leading frameworks such as ISO or NIST to help guide your organization along the way to make sure that we stay in compliance and have those robust governance, risk, and compliance frameworks in place to maintain our policies. No, that's really great. And I've been learning so much about these regulations from the two of you today, but I really want to know is there anything that you'd want the listeners to know that we might have not covered so far, or really any major takeaways you really want to instill on any of the listeners here today?
The biggest one that I would love to share is that you don't need to do everything at once, but the best time to start is today. Or as I think a Japanese proverb says, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time to do it is today. And that is applicable to these legislations as well.
No, that's great. And I love that philosophy of, it would be great if this was already in place, but it isn't. Let's start this process now and get ahead of it. Selma, is there anything you'd like the listeners to impart with?
Well, one key takeaway would also be regarding the board members and their awareness on these topics, which, as we have discussed, is something that is relatively new, especially given their liability within these frameworks. So the earlier they start, the better it is.
Yeah, I really like that one, Selma. That's spot on. What we know is that board members will need to educate themselves on cybersecurity. We also know that cybersecurity is always evolving. So this really means that you can already start today and get a broad understanding of cybersecurity, how it impacts your organization, how you can ask the right questions to your experts to make sure that as a board you make the right decisions. And this is something that you could start today.
Absolutely. It never hurts to start learning. And it can be a challenge to understand, where do I start with this process? Is this applicable to me? How am I going to move ahead with it? And really, that's where you start relying on some of your trusted advisors, such as, Gideon and Selma, who are experts in this field. So if you're listening to this and walking away with a bit of concern that you haven't started thinking through these processes, I think what we're all saying is, don't worry, don't panic. Understand that this is going to be a process, and there are people out there to help you, such as Gideon and Selma. I really want to say to the both of you, I really appreciate your time today. This has been a really enlightening conversation for myself and hopefully the listeners as well. Thank you for joining the second episode of the Full Disclosure Podcast. If you tune in on our next episode, we'll be covering U.S. regulations and how that's going to impact businesses from where I'm from in the United States. But really appreciate you joining us here today, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Matthew.
We are SRM. Search your first call to find out more.